Tonight, we begin with a development that U.S. officials had feared, dismissed, and prepared for. A move that unfolded not over weeks, but in hours. Hours that shifted the calculus of this war. Hours that forced emergency meetings in Washington. Hours that drew an urgent warning from the White House itself. What Vladimir Putin did today crossed a line that American officials had hoped would hold. And when that line broke, Ukraine did not hesitate. They responded with precision, speed, and devastating force. For months now, there had been signals, not official statements, not formal declarations, just signals that Putin was preparing something unprecedented. Putin has been aggressive, yes, but he has been calculated in his aggression. His moves have followed a certain pattern, a rhythm, almost a predictability. But what set off alarm bells in Washington this week was that the pattern went silent. Intelligence analysts who monitor Russian military activity know the indicators. The movement of mobile launch platforms, the repositioning of strategic bombers, the unusual communication blackouts, the sudden pullback of diplomatic channels, all of that went quiet. And whenever Putin goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. Early this morning, Pentagon officials detected what they described as significant strategic repositioning, including the deployment of assets that had not been activated in over 18 months. These are the kinds of weapon systems that Russia only deploys when they are signaling something very specific. Escalation, intimidation, or preparation for expanded operations. Observers didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Putin was changing his military posture. And when an adversary shifts posture without explanation, the White House pays attention. The warning issued by the White House tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Officials after emergency briefings described Putin's move as reckless, destabilizing, and perhaps most importantly, inconsistent with any path toward de-escalation. But intimidation only works if the target hesitates. Ukraine did not. Within 6 hours of detecting the Russian repositioning, Ukraine launched coordinated strikes. These weren't standard defensive operations. These were deep strike missions, systems, and tactics that Ukraine only deploys when they are preparing to disrupt Russian command infrastructure. Tonight, Ukrainian military sources confirmed that forces launched precision strikes on military installations, including a logistics hub recently reinforced for what analysts believe was a major offensive push. Ukraine struck before Russia could consolidate. They hit fuel depots. They hit ammunition storage facilities. They hit communication centers preparing to coordinate expanded operations. In other words, Ukraine targeted the nervous system of Russia's escalation. This is what made the White House warning so urgent. Putin's escalation wasn't just symbolic, it was actionable. It represented the kind of move that could dramatically widen this conflict if left unchecked. And Ukraine, understanding that fully, responded with force. Not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't target civilian areas. They didn't strike indiscriminately. They hit command nodes. They hit supply lines. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. Western intelligence officials now believe that Putin's latest move was designed to test the resolve of Ukraine and its allies after months of political uncertainty in Washington. Putin wanted to see whether Ukraine would falter without guaranteed support. But instead, the opposite happened. Ukraine didn't hesitate. They launched a counteroffensive that was so swift, so precise, that even Moscow noticed. You don't get the Kremlin's attention easily. But today, Ukraine did. Defense analysts described Putin's shift as coercive signaling, a way to intimidate without fully committing. But Ukraine proved today that they remain both capable and willing. Their strikes were timed so precisely that Russian forces had no opportunity to disperse assets. That timing matters because it shows battlefield intelligence superiority. It shows that Ukraine is not simply reacting, they are anticipating. As reports continued coming in throughout the day, we learned more about the scale of Ukraine's response. Ukrainian drone units carried out strikes on rear area positions, forcing Russian logistics convoys to halt. Artillery brigades targeted ammunition depots expanded in the last 72 hours. Special operations units operating behind lines reportedly disrupted communication relays used by Russia to coordinate frontline movements. This wasn't just retaliation. This wasn't just defense. This was operational disruption. This was strategic denial. And strategic denial is the one thing Russia has struggled to counter since the war began. Remember, Putin thought this invasion would take days. He thought Kyiv would fall within a week. He thought the West would lose interest after the first winter. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Ukraine remains standing. The West remains engaged. And Russia remains bogged down. What makes this moment so critical and so volatile is that Putin's latest move happened at a time when he is under extraordinary internal pressure. Hardliners want total commitment to victory. Pragmatists want a negotiated exit. Oligarchs want sanctions relief. Military commanders want resources they're not getting. Putin is balancing these demands while managing a war that has cost far more than projected. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. The White House statement, now circulating through diplomatic channels, was designed to signal that Washington is not willing to allow unchecked escalation. Administration officials said plainly that Putin's repositioning was inconsistent with responsible conduct. That is diplomatic language for, we see what you're doing and there will be consequences. You don't usually hear that tone from Washington unless something serious is at stake. Meanwhile, Ukraine's President Zelensky addressed the nation in a brief Defiant speech tonight. He said, "We will not be intimidated by threats." He said, "Every escalation will be met with resolve." And he said, "Ukraine fights not for territory alone, but for the right to exist." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a nation that understands just how high the stakes have become. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Putin's latest move wasn't isolated. Along with the military repositioning, Russian cyber units increased attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure, state media amplified nuclear rhetoric, diplomatic channels reduced communication with Western capitals. All of this happened within the same 48 hours. When Putin moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. Analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Putin is preparing for a renewed offensive. Another is that Putin is attempting to fracture Western unity before critical support votes. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Putin is attempting to normalize escalatory behavior. But today, Ukraine took that card off the table. They didn't wait for permission. They didn't delay for consultation. They didn't show hesitation. They acted decisively. What we're watching now is a test of endurance. Putin wants to see if the West will tire. Ukraine wants to show that resistance remains unbroken. Washington wants to prevent uncontrolled escalation, and Europe wants to prevent the conflict from spreading. Tonight, we've heard from defense officials monitoring Russian repositioning in real time. They say Russian forces appear to be reassessing after today's strikes. They say command and control disruption was significant. And they say Putin's decision to escalate is likely part of a pressure campaign intended to test alliance cohesion. But Ukraine is not backing down. Their response today, swift, surgical, and sustained, sent a message to Putin that escalation has costs. And it sent a message to Washington that Ukraine remains a capable partner. As the situation develops, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Putin hoped to achieve. But what we do know is that the White House warning was timely. It aligned Western messaging. It reinforced deterrence posture. And it supported Ukraine's operational response. What happens next will depend on what Putin does in the next 72 hours. If he de-escalates, this moment will be remembered as a failed gambit. If he doubles down, Ukraine and its allies have already shown they are prepared. And tonight, for the first time in weeks, the Kremlin appears to be recalculating. Moscow is quiet, too quiet. And when Putin is quiet, it means he is reassessing. It means he is choosing his next move carefully. Because tonight, Putin learned something he has learned many times before. Ukraine will not break. The West will not abandon them, and escalation comes with consequences. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. Putin's gamble did not pay off. Ukraine's resolve remains intact, and the world is watching. And we will be here watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.